A nation at war with itself, this was America in 1942. While its young men fought and died across the Atlantic and Pacific, an unexpected population emerged within its borders, nearly 400,000 enemy soldiers captured on distant battlefields. Among them, over 50,000 Germans would find themselves transported to the unlikeliest of destinations, the vast, sun-scorched plains of Texas. What awaited them shocked these battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans: ice cream, Coca-Cola, and a standard of living that rivaled what many had known in pre-war Germany. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. April 1943. As Allied forces pressed the advantage in North Africa, capturing thousands of Axis troops, the United States faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. With European nations devastated by war and unable to house prisoners, America would become home to nearly 500,000 enemy combatants. The War Department's solution was elegant in its simplicity: convert existing military installations into prisoner-of-war camps and build new ones in sparsely populated regions, particularly in Texas, where abundant land, warm climate, and distance from both coastlines made escape nearly impossible. The first German POWs arrived at the ports of Galveston and Corpus Christi in 1942, blinking in the harsh Texas sunlight as they disembarked from crowded troopships. Many had been captured during the fierce desert fighting in Tunisia, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had finally succumbed to overwhelming Allied pressure. These men, most in their 20s, some as young as 17, had expected harsh treatment as prisoners. Instead, they found themselves in a strange new world where the greatest danger was sunburn, not starvation. Hauptmann Werner Fuchs, a 28-year-old tank commander from Rommel's 15th Panzer Division, recorded his initial impressions in a diary later discovered in the Texas State Archives. "We were certain the Americans would treat us as we had been told they would, with brutality and neglect. When the train stopped at Camp Hearn, we were given cold Coca-Cola and cigarettes by the guards. I still could not believe this was not some elaborate trick." Fuchs would spend the next 3 years at Camp Hearn, becoming fluent in English and developing a lifelong fondness for American baseball. The transformation of rural Texas into a vast archipelago of POW camps represented one of the most remarkable and least remembered chapters of the American home front. By late 1943, Texas housed more than 50,000 German prisoners in nearly 24 major camps and dozens of smaller branch camps. Camp Swift near Bastrop held 10,000 men. Camp Fannin outside Tyler housed 6,000. Camp Hearn, Camp Hood, Camp Maxey, Camp Howes across the state. Barbed wire enclosures housed men who had fought with Rommel in Africa or with Kesselring in Italy. What makes this story so compelling is not merely the incongruity of German soldiers in Texas, but America's strategic decision to follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. Even as reports emerged of the brutal treatment of American POWs in German and Japanese hands. This policy was both moral and practical. Treating enemy prisoners humanely might encourage reciprocal treatment for captured Americans. It also served as a powerful propaganda tool, showcasing American prosperity and democratic values to men who had been immersed in Nazi ideology. The camps themselves were constructed according to a standardized design developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Typically housing between 3,000 and 4,000 prisoners, each camp resembled a small self-contained town. Barracks were simple but comfortable, with heating in winter and adequate ventilation in summer. Each camp included a mess hall, hospital, canteen, recreation facilities, workshops, and often a theater. The perimeter was marked by barbed wire fencing and guard towers, but within this boundary, prisoners enjoyed considerable freedom of movement. Oberstleutnant Friedrich von Liebenstein, a career officer captured in Tunisia, was interned at Camp Mexia. In letters to his family, carefully censored but preserved in military archives, he expressed astonishment at conditions in the camp. The food here is abundant beyond belief. For breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee with real cream and sugar. Lunch and dinner include meat daily. The Americans eat like this all the time, even their enlisted men. No wonder they are so large and energetic. Von Liebenstein, like many senior officers, initially discouraged fraternization with American guards, but gradually relaxed this stance as the reality of their situation became clear. The daily routine in these camps followed a predictable pattern. Reveille sounded at 5:45 a.m., followed by breakfast at 6:15. Roll call was conducted at 7 p.m., after which prisoners reported to work assignments. Lunch was served at noon, with work resuming until 4:30 p.m. Evening roll call preceded dinner, and lights out was enforced at 10 p.m. Sundays were generally free days, devoted to recreation, religious services, or cultural activities. Critically, under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could not be forced to work on projects directly related to the war effort. However, enlisted men could be required to work primarily in agriculture or non-military support roles, and they received payment for their labor. Officers could not be compelled to work, but could volunteer for paid positions. This system addressed severe labor shortages created by military conscription while respecting international law. The economic impact of this labor program was substantial. In 1944 alone, German POWs in Texas harvested more than 50 million pounds of cotton and millions more pounds of other crops. They worked in canneries, lumber mills, and on infrastructure projects. Without this labor, many Texas farms and businesses would have faced economic collapse. For their work, prisoners earned 80 cents per day in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen or saved for eventual repatriation. Camp economies operated on a surprisingly sophisticated level. Each camp had its own internal currency system, with prisoners paid for work and able to purchase items at the camp canteen. Available products included toiletries, snacks, cigarettes, writing materials, and small luxuries. Coffee, sugar, and a chocolate were particularly prized commodities. Even beer was available in limited quantities in some camps, though with reduced alcohol content. Unteroffizier Kurt Wagner, a former bank clerk from Hamburg, interned at Camp Swift, managed the camp's financial accounts. In a post-war memoir, he noted, "We had our own internal economy. Men who received packages from home or who earned more from work details often traded with others. We even established a camp savings bank where men could deposit their earnings. Some prisoners accumulated hundreds of dollars by the war's end." Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Texas POW experience was the cultural and educational life that flourished behind barbed wire. The German military's strong emphasis on hierarchy and discipline meant that camp populations quickly organized themselves, establishing internal governance structures under the watchful but generally non-interfering eye of American authorities. This self-organization extended to educational and recreational activities. Camp Hearn became particularly noted for its cultural offerings. Prisoners established a camp university with courses ranging from English language to advanced mathematics, taught by prisoners who had been professors, teachers, or experts in civilian life. A camp orchestra performed weekly concerts. A theater group staged plays by Goethe, Schiller, and Shakespeare. Workshops produced furniture, artwork, and crafts of remarkable quality, many of which survive in museums and private collections today. Fritz Haus, a gifted artist who had studied at the Munich Academy of Fine Arts before the war, established a studio at Camp Hearn, where he painted portraits of fellow prisoners and landscapes of the surrounding Texas countryside. His work caught the attention of camp authorities, who arranged an exhibition in nearby Bryan. Several local families purchased his paintings, initiating relationships that would endure long after the war. Haus later returned to Texas as an immigrant in 1952, establishing a successful career as a commercial artist in Houston. Sport played a crucial role in maintaining morale and physical fitness. Soccer was naturally the most popular activity, with camp leagues and intercamp tournaments organized with remarkable seriousness. Boxing, tennis, basketball, and track and field also featured prominently. Perhaps most surprisingly, many camps fielded baseball teams, with American Guards often participating in informal coaching. Gefreiter Josef Kraus, a former semi-professional soccer player from Bavaria, organized sports at Camp Swift. In a 1985 interview for an oral history project, he recalled, "The Americans could not understand why we took soccer so seriously. We had leagues, statistics, championship matches. The guards would watch and slowly began to appreciate the skill involved. Some even started playing with us during their off-duty hours. It was on the soccer field that I first began to see Americans as individuals, not just as enemies." Religion provided another source of comfort and continuity. Most camps had both Protestant and Catholic services conducted by prisoner chaplains or visiting clergy. Jewish German soldiers who had served in the Wehrmacht, despite the Nazi regime's anti-Semitism, were typically separated from other prisoners for their protection and housed in dedicated facilities. Christmas was observed with special meals, concerts, and handmade decorations. These religious observances helped normalize the prison experience and provided spiritual support during a time of profound uncertainty. The relationship between prisoners and guards evolved significantly over time. Initial wariness on both sides gradually gave way to a more nuanced interaction. American guards, many of whom were older reservists or men deemed unfit for combat duty, often developed a grudging respect for their charges. Prisoners, especially those with limited Nazi indoctrination, frequently revised their preconceptions about Americans. Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson, a guard at Camp Hearn, kept a personal journal throughout his service. His entries track this evolving relationship. June 1943, "Still don't trust these Krauts. They're disciplined, I'll give them that. But they look at us like we're beneath them." By December of the same year, his tone had shifted. "Played chess with that lieutenant from Munich today. He speaks better English than half the boys from my hometown. Hard to square him with the monsters we see in the newsreels." This is not to suggest that camp life was free from tension or conflict. The prisoner population included dedicated Nazis who maintained party discipline within the camps, sometimes threatening or assaulting prisoners deemed insufficiently loyal to Hitler. In several camps, including Camp Hearn and Camp Swift, murders occurred when suspected informants or anti-Nazi prisoners were killed by hardline elements. American authorities struggled to identify and segregate die-hard Nazis from the general population. In September 1943, at Camp Mexia, this internal conflict reached a tragic conclusion when Corporal Hugo Kraus was found hanged in a shower facility. Investigation revealed he had been killed by fellow prisoners after expressing anti-Hitler sentiments and cooperating too enthusiastically with American authorities. The 7 prisoners identified as responsible were tried by American military court and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. This incident prompted a more systematic effort to separate Nazi loyalists from other prisoners. The War Department developed a classification system categorizing prisoners as black, ardent Nazis, gray, nominal party supporters, or white, anti-Nazis or non-political prisoners. By 1944, efforts were made to segregate these groups, with confirmed Nazis transferred to more secure facilities, while anti-Nazi prisoners received greater privileges and opportunities for re-education. This classification was imperfect and inconsistently applied, but it represented a recognition of the political complexity within the prisoner population. For many prisoners, the most significant challenge was psychological rather than physical. Separated from families, uncertain about the war's progression or conditions at home, and faced with the prospect of indefinite captivity, depression and anxiety were common. Letters from home arrived irregularly, heavily censored, and often months after they were written. News about the war came primarily through American newspapers and radio, sources many prisoners initially distrusted. Feldwebel Manfred Schneider, a Luftwaffe non-commissioned officer held at Camp Swift, recorded his psychological journey in a diary, now held by the National World War II Museum. March 10, 1944, Radio reports bombing of Frankfurt. Mother and sisters live there. No way to know if they are safe. This uncertainty is worse than any physical hardship. 3 months later, he wrote, "Finally received letter from mother. Their apartment building destroyed, but they escaped to cousin's home in countryside. First night I have slept through since hearing of the bombing." Perhaps the most unexpected aspect of the German POW experience in Texas was the degree of interaction with the local civilian population. While official policy discouraged fraternization, the reality of daily life, especially on work details, brought prisoners into regular contact with Texans. Initial hostility often gave way to more complex relationships, particularly in rural areas where German prisoners worked alongside American farmers. Heinz Müller, a 19-year-old private captured in Sicily, was assigned to an agricultural detail near Navasota. In a post-war interview, he described his changing relationship with a Texas farm family. "At first, they watched us like we might attack them with our hose. The farmer's wife would bring water but wouldn't speak to us. By harvest time, she was bringing homemade cookies and asking about our families. The farmer himself taught me to drive his tractor. These were good people who recognized we were just soldiers, not monsters." These developing relationships did not sit well with everyone. Families of American servicemen sometimes objected to what they perceived as overly comfortable conditions for enemy prisoners, especially as reports emerged of harsh treatment in German camps. Local newspapers occasionally ran editorials questioning the wisdom of coddling prisoners with ice cream and Coca-Cola while American boys were dying overseas. Military authorities countered that they were simply following the Geneva Convention and that humane treatment served strategic objectives. Mrs. Eleanor Delaney of Bryan, whose son was fighting in Italy, wrote a scathing letter to the Houston Chronicle in August 1944. "Yesterday, I saw German prisoners in our grocery store, buying items that we civilians can barely get with our ration coupons. They were laughing and joking with the guard. Meanwhile, my boy writes that he hasn't had a decent meal in weeks. Where is the justice?" Such sentiments were understandable, but overlooked the complex calculus behind American POW policy. The most dramatic challenge to camp discipline came in the form of escape attempts. Despite the geographical barriers, Texas offered few hiding places and long distances to neutral borders. Approximately 25 prisoners escaped temporarily from Texas camps during the war. Most were recaptured within days, often after being reported by civilians. The most determined escapees made elaborate plans, accumulated supplies, and studied maps, but faced nearly insurmountable odds. The case of Unteroffizier Friedrich Wilhelm Joachim illustrates both the ingenuity and futility of these escape attempts. Interned at Camp Hearn, Joachim spent months planning his break. He created a convincing American civilian outfit by modifying his POW uniform, hoarded food from Red Cross parcels, and even constructed a detailed map based on information gleaned from newspapers and conversations with guards. In August 1944, he slipped away from an agricultural work detail and managed to travel over 100 miles before being captured in San Antonio. When questioned about his motives, knowing the war was turning against Germany, he simply stated, "It is the duty of a soldier to try to escape." As 1944 progressed, news of Allied advances in Europe reached the camps. The reaction among prisoners varied dramatically. Nazi loyalists dismissed these reports as propaganda, while others began to contemplate the implications of German defeat. The dynamic within the camps shifted as the formerly dominant pro-Nazi faction lost credibility. For many prisoners, this period marked the beginning of a profound reevaluation of their beliefs and allegiances. December 1944 brought shocking news: the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Temporarily, Nazi supporters in the camps regained their voice, pointing to this offensive as evidence that Germany could still win. This optimism was short-lived. By January 1945, as reports of the offensive's failure reached Texas, reality set in for all but the most fanatical. Germany was losing the war, and these men would eventually return to a defeated homeland. With this realization came practical concerns. What would await them in post-war Germany? Would their homes still exist? Their families? Would they face punishment or reprisals? Would the Americans simply hand them over to the Soviets? These anxieties intensified as the war in Europe approached its conclusion, creating a paradoxical situation in which many prisoners dreaded the very liberation they had previously longed for. On May 8, 1945, as news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the Texas camps, reactions ranged from relief to despair. At Camp Hearn, prisoners gathered in silence as the announcement was read. Some wept openly. Others stood in rigid military posture, faces impassive. For men who had defined themselves as soldiers of the Third Reich, this moment represented more than military defeat. It was the collapse of an identity, a worldview, and for many, a source of national pride. What followed was a period of profound uncertainty. With the war in Europe concluded but fighting continuing in the Pacific, the status of German POWs remained in limbo. International agreements stipulated that prisoners should be repatriated as soon as possible after hostilities ended, but practical considerations complicated this process. War-devastated Germany could scarcely absorb an immediate influx of returned prisoners. Allied authorities worried about releasing potentially unrepentant Nazis into a fragile post-war environment. And increasingly, tensions between Western allies and the Soviet Union raised questions about which Germany these men would return to. For the men in Texas camps, this uncertainty manifested as a strange twilight period, no longer active participants in a war, yet still prisoners, still separated from their former lives. Camp routines continued, but with subtle adjustments. Work details remained important both for camp economies and for maintaining morale, but educational programs increasingly focused on democratic values and preparation for civilian life in post-war Germany. In this suspended state, as the hot Texas summer of 1945 gave way to autumn, these men waited to learn what fate awaited them. Would they return to a homeland in ruins? Would they face a future behind Soviet lines? Or would they somehow find opportunity in this catastrophe that had engulfed their nation and their lives? As November 1945 approached, bringing colder weather to the Texas plains, the first groups of prisoners were finally designated for repatriation. Their time in this strange wartime limbo was coming to an end, but the journey ahead, back to a Germany transformed by defeat and occupation, promised challenges perhaps even greater than those they had faced in captivity. As the trains departed from Texas stations, carrying the first contingents of returning prisoners eastward toward Atlantic ports, they left behind a landscape transformed by their presence. Fields they had cultivated, buildings they had constructed, and relationships they had formed with Americans who had been their enemies. These would remain as tangible legacies of this remarkable historical episode. And in the memories of these men, carried back across the Atlantic, would remain the incongruous image of ice cream and Coca-Cola in the middle of global war, symbols of an America they had come to know in a way few of their countrymen ever would. The repatriation process began slowly in November 1945, prioritizing anti-Nazi prisoners and those with specialized skills needed for reconstruction. By January 1946, regular shipments of prisoners departed from East Coast ports, primarily New York and Hampton Roads, Virginia. The journey back to Europe was markedly different from their initial transport to America. Gone was the fear of submarine attack. Gone, too, was the uncertainty about their destination. Yet new anxieties replaced the old. What would they find in a defeated Germany? Otto Engelhardt, a 23-year-old former artillery officer from Hamburg, was among the first group to leave Camp Swift. Before departure, he was interviewed by a representative from the YMCA War Prisoners' Aid, a neutral organization that had provided educational materials to the camps. "I am not the same man who arrived here 3 years ago," Engelhardt confessed. "I believed everything our leaders told us about Americans, that they were soft, decadent, racially impure. Now I have lived among them. I have read their books, seen their communities. I return with different eyes. Engelhardt would eventually become a professor of American Studies at the University of Hamburg, maintaining correspondence with Texans he had met, until his death in 1997. The ships carrying former prisoners to Europe were often the same Liberty. Ships and Victory ships that had transported American troops to the war zone. Conditions were Spartan but adequate, with men housed in converted cargo holds, fitted with bunks. The voyage typically took 2 weeks, during which the men received orientation about conditions in post-war Germany and practical advice about reintegration. Some ships stopped first in England or France, where prisoners were temporarily housed before final transport to Germany. Upon arrival in Europe, the men faced a bureaucratic and logistical maze. Processing centers established in Bremen and other ports registered returning prisoners, conducted final security screenings, and provided basic supplies and a small amount of currency. Most critically, these centers attempted to determine which occupation zone each man would be sent to based on their pre-war residence. For those whose homes were now in the Soviet zone, this determination carried enormous implications. Wilhelm Kohler, whose family home had been in Dresden, now in the Soviet zone, faced this dilemma at the Bremen Processing Center. In a letter later sent to his former camp commander at Camp Herne, he described his decision. When the American officer asked if I wished to go to my home in Dresden, I hesitated. We had heard stories about Russians sending German prisoners to labor camps in Siberia. I thought of my mother and sisters still in Dresden, but chose to remain in the American zone. This decision haunts me daily, but perhaps saved my life. Kohler would not see his family again until 1972, when limited travel between East and West Germany became possible. For those returning to homes in Western occupation zones, the immediate challenge was more practical than political. Transportation infrastructure had been devastated by Allied bombing. Rail lines, bridges, and roads were damaged or destroyed. A journey that might have taken hours before the war now required days, often involving multiple forms of transport and overnight stays in emergency shelters. German currency had little value, and the Reichsmark would soon be replaced entirely by occupation currency. The basic necessities of life, food, housing, clothing, were in critically short supply. Gottfried Meyer, a former Afrika Korps sergeant who had spent 3 years at Camp Mexia, described his journey to his family home near Frankfurt. From the port, we were transported by American trucks to a rail junction, then by train as far as the tracks allowed, then by foot. I walked the last 20 kilometers to my village. When I arrived, I could not recognize the street where I had grown up. Every building was damaged or destroyed. My family's apartment building was simply gone, a pile of rubble. I stood there with my American-issued backpack containing new clothes, coffee, and cigarettes, relatively rich compared to those who had endured the bombing, yet homeless. The physical destruction these men encountered was matched by social and political disorientation. The Nazi regime that had dominated German life for 12 years had collapsed utterly. Military government by the occupying powers now controlled everything from food rationing to permissible political activities. Former party members faced potential restrictions on employment and civil rights. German society itself was in flux, with millions of refugees from eastern territories, returning soldiers, and displaced civilians creating a fluid, chaotic situation. For former POWs returning from America, this new Germany often proved more alien than the Texas camps they had left behind. Many found themselves in an unexpected position, serving as cultural interpreters between occupying Americans and local Germans. Their experience in the United States, their acquired English language skills, and their understanding of American attitudes made them valuable intermediaries in communities trying to navigate occupation. Kurt Schneider, who had worked as a translator at Camp Swift, found employment with the American military government in Munich within weeks of his return. The Americans needed Germans they could trust, who understood their methods and expectations, he explained in a 1977 oral history. Having been a prisoner in Texas was almost like having a university degree in American studies. We knew how they thought, how they operated. Many of us became bridges between the occupiers and the occupied. Not all returning prisoners found such ready acceptance. Those identified as committed Nazis during their internment faced additional screening and restrictions upon return. Some were detained for further investigation or even prosecution if evidence suggested involvement in war crimes. Others were banned from public employment and faced social ostracism. The complex denazification process implemented by occupation authorities created categories of political reliability that determined a person's opportunities in post-war society. Family reunification brought its own challenges. Wives had managed households through bombing, food shortages, and chaos. Children had grown up with absent fathers, some barely remembering the men who now returned to claim paternal authority. The psychological adjustments required on both sides created tension in many households. Divorce rates among returning prisoners exceeded the national average, reflecting the strain these separations placed on marriages. Heinrich Müller, who had been a baker in civilian life before the war, returned to find his wife running the family bakery in Heidelberg with remarkable success. She had kept the business alive through impossible conditions, he recalled. When I suggested resuming my role as master baker, she looked at me like I was mad. She had developed her own recipes, her own methods. In truth, she was now the better baker. It took months for us to find a new balance, for me to accept that I could not simply reclaim my pre-war life. Perhaps the most profound challenge for returning prisoners was psychological, reconciling the defeat of their nation, the revelation of Nazi atrocities, and their own participation in a military that had committed terrible crimes. The POW camps in Texas had provided gradual exposure to information about the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes, primarily through newspapers and educational programs. Nevertheless, the full impact of these revelations hit many only upon their return to Germany, where denazification programs explicitly confronted Germans with evidence of these crimes. Joseph Bergman, a former Luftwaffe pilot held at Camp Herne, described this reckoning in a memoir published in 1960. In Texas, we had seen the photos in Life magazine, the camps, the bodies. Many refused to believe, calling it propaganda. I was uncertain myself. After returning to Germany, I spoke with people who had seen these things directly. A childhood friend had been among the troops who liberated Buchenwald. He described what he had seen, his hand shaking as he spoke. I could no longer deny the truth. That night I burned my Luftwaffe uniform. I could not look at it without shame. This psychological adjustment occurred against the backdrop of severe material hardship. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was particularly harsh, with fuel shortages, continued food rationing, and inadequate housing creating conditions arguably worse than those in wartime. Former POWs from American camps, accustomed to abundant food and heated barracks, found this reality especially jarring. Some openly expressed nostalgia for their captivity, a sentiment that understandably angered Germans who had endured the war at home. Yet gradually, as 1947 gave way to 1948, conditions in Western Germany began to improve. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, injected crucial economic support. The currency reform of 1948 stabilized the economy. The Berlin airlift demonstrated Western commitment to German recovery. Against this backdrop of tentative renewal, former POWs who had been in America found themselves with certain advantages: English language skills, understanding of American business practices, and often specific vocational training received in the camps. Walter Schmidt had learned automotive repair while interned at Camp Swift, working on military vehicles. In 1950, he established a repair shop in Stuttgart, specializing in American cars, which were becoming popular among occupation personnel and wealthy Germans. The skills I learned as a prisoner became the foundation of my business, Schmidt noted in a letter to his former work supervisor, now preserved in the National Archives. Art Countels. Without those 2 years working in the camp motor pool, I would never have had this opportunity. Sometimes I think I should send a thank you note to Hitler for getting me captured. The long-term impact of the American POW experience varied widely among former prisoners. Some, particularly those already opposed to Nazism or those who had developed strong connections with Americans, became enthusiastic supporters of democratic institutions and Western alignment. Others harbored resentment about their captivity despite the relatively humane conditions, viewing it as an humiliation and maintaining distance from American influences. The majority fell somewhere between, pragmatically adapting to new realities while processing their wartime experiences in personal ways. What remained consistent in virtually all accounts was the element of surprise. That enemy captivity in distant Texas had proved so contrary to expectations. This contradiction between anticipated harsh treatment and the actual experience of relative comfort became a central element in how these men integrated their POW experience into their life narratives. It represented a dissonance that forced reconsideration of other assumptions and beliefs, contributing to the broader process of German reorientation after National Socialism. For Americans in Texas, the departure of the German prisoners also required adjustment. Local economies had grown dependent on POW labor, particularly in agriculture. The sudden removal of this workforce created immediate labor shortages. Communities that had developed complex relationships with their prisoners, relationships ranging from employment to friendship to romance, felt the absence of these men who had briefly been part of their wartime landscape. Physical evidence of the camps soon began to disappear. Military necessity had dictated temporary construction, and most camp structures were dismantled or repurposed shortly after the prisoners departed. Land was returned to previous uses or sold for development. By 1950, a visitor to most former campsites would find little evidence of their wartime purpose. This physical erasure contributed to the fading of this episode from public memory, despite its historical significance. Yet intangible connections persisted. Letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Packages containing coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes, valuable currencies in post-war Germany, were sent by Texans to former prisoners and their families. In some cases, these connections blossomed into invitations for former prisoners to return to Texas as immigrants. Taking advantage of the 1948 Displaced Persons Act and subsequent legislation that eased restrictions on German immigration to the United States. Karl Weber had worked as a cook at Camp Hearn, preparing meals for both prisoners and American personnel. His skill impressed the camp's American mess officer, who owned a restaurant in nearby Bryan. In 1949, Weber received sponsorship to immigrate, eventually becoming head chef at the restaurant and a naturalized American citizen. His story was not unique. Dozens of former prisoners returned to Texas as permanent residents in the decade following the war, drawn by economic opportunities and personal connections formed during captivity. The legacy of the POW camps extended beyond individual relationships to influence institutional connections. Educational exchanges between Texas universities and German institutions were established with the assistance of former prisoners who had returned to academic positions. Business partnerships developed, particularly in agriculture, where German prisoners had gained intimate knowledge of Texas farming methods. These connections, while rarely acknowledged in formal diplomatic histories, constituted a form of grassroots foreign relations that contributed to post-war reconciliation. By the mid-1950s, as Germany achieved sovereignty and joined NATO, the former adversarial relationship had been replaced by alliance. Former POWs who had experienced America firsthand often served as informal ambassadors for this new relationship, explaining American perspectives to their communities and counteracting lingering anti-American sentiment. Their experience represented a peculiar inversion. Enemy soldiers who had gained unique insight into American society precisely because of their captivity. Hans Muller, who had been a prisoner at Camp Swift, later became mayor of his hometown near Hanover. When American forces established a base nearby in the 1950s, Muller organized a welcome committee and helped integrate American personnel into the community. In a speech preserved in local archives, he explained his motivation. "Some ask why I'm so welcoming to former enemies. I tell them that, in Texas, I learned an important truth. Americans are not what our propaganda told us. They treated us, their prisoners, with decency and according to international law. This showed their true character more than any words could have. If former enemies can become friends, there is hope for lasting peace. The most profound legacy of the POW experience may have been its contribution to the democratization of West Germany. Men who had observed American institutions and values firsthand, even from behind barbed wire, returned with perspectives that often aligned with the goals of occupation authorities. While American re-education efforts in the camps achieved mixed results, the simple exposure to American society left lasting impressions that surfaced in unexpected ways during Germany's post-war reconstruction. Richard Miller had shown artistic talent while interned at Camp Herne, creating sculptures and paintings that caught the attention of camp authorities. After repatriation and art school in Munich, he became a successful commercial artist. In 1956, he designed a poster for West Germany's emerging democratic institutions that won a national competition. The imagery, a ballot box illuminated by sunlight, borrowed consciously from American political symbolism he had observed during his captivity. When interviewed about his design, Miller explained, "Democracy requires symbols that speak to ordinary people. In America, I saw how they made citizenship something to be proud of, not just a legal status. This is what we needed in Germany, to make democracy something felt, not just a system imposed by occupiers." As West Germany achieved economic recovery and political stability through the 1950s, the former POWs who had experienced America integrated their wartime captivity into larger narratives about German defeat, occupation, and eventual reconstruction. For many, the Texas camps represented a transitional space, both literally and metaphorically, between the Third Reich and the Federal Republic. Their time in America had provided a preview of democratic values and practices that would eventually take root in Western Germany, making their captivity an unexpected site of political education. By the 1960s, as a new generation of Germans came of age with no direct memory of the war, interest in the POW experience began to wane. Veterans groups occasionally organized reunions, and some academic studies documented this chapter of German-American relations, but public awareness diminished. In the United States, the story of enemy prisoners housed on American soil received even less attention, overshadowed by narratives focusing on American military accomplishments and wartime production. This mutual forgetting began to reverse in the 1970s, as aging former prisoners sought to document their experiences and reconnect with the places and people they had known in captivity. Amateur historians in Texas communities became interested in local campsites, collecting oral histories and artifacts. Academic historians, recognizing the significance of this understudied aspect of the war, began more systematic research. By the 1980s, several scholarly works had appeared, placing the POW experience within broader contexts of military history, international law, and cultural exchange. Formal recognition of this history emerged gradually. In 1978, the Texas Historical Commission placed its first historical marker at a former POW campsite. Museums in communities that had hosted camps began collecting and displaying artifacts, handcrafted items made by prisoners, photographs, documents, and personal accounts. In Germany, the POW experience entered the growing field of Alltagsgeschichte, the history of everyday life, as scholars recognized that these men's stories offered unique perspectives on both the war and its aftermath. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and subsequent German reunification created new context for understanding the POW experience. Former prisoners whose homes had been in East Germany could finally speak openly about their American captivity, which communist authorities had previously viewed with suspicion. Archives in the former East Germany became accessible, revealing new dimensions of the repatriation process, particularly for those prisoners who had returned to Soviet-controlled territory. This broadened understanding highlighted the divergent paths of former POWs depending on which Germany they had returned to. Franz Schneider had been held at Camp Swift until 1946, then repatriated to his hometown near Leipzig, which fell under Soviet control. Unlike his counterparts in Western Germany, Schneider found that his American connection made him politically suspect. "I was questioned repeatedly by the Stasi about my time in Texas," he revealed in a 1992 interview after German reunification. "They were convinced I had been recruited as an American spy. My English language skills, which would have been an asset in the West, became a liability in the East. I learned to never mention my time in America." Schneider worked as a mechanic until retirement, his education and potential limited by political suspicion. The contrast between the experiences of POWs who returned to East versus West Germany provides a stark illustration of how the emerging Cold War shaped individual lives. Those in the West often benefited from their American experience, while those in the East frequently concealed it. This divergence reflected the broader division of Germany itself: one nation, two radically different trajectories, with former POWs embodying this split in particularly personal ways. As the Cold War receded into history, scholarly and public interest in the POW story continued to grow. The Camp Hearn Historic Site, established in 2002, became the first comprehensive attempt to preserve and interpret a Texas POW camp. Archaeological excavations at campsites revealed artifacts and structural remains that complemented documentary sources. Digital archives made previously scattered materials accessible to researchers worldwide. By the early 21st century, what had been a nearly forgotten chapter of World War II had emerged as a recognized component of both Texas history and German-American relations. This renewed attention coincided with the aging and passing of the generation that had experienced the war firsthand. Veterans organizations on both sides recognized the urgency of collecting remaining testimonies. The German POWs in Texas Oral History Project, launched in 2005, recorded interviews with dozens of surviving former prisoners, most then in their 80s. These accounts, alongside digitized diaries, letters, and photographs, preserved personal perspectives that official records could not capture. Eric Weber, who had been captured in North Africa at age 18 and spent 3 years at Camp Hearn, participated in this project at age 83. His testimony reflected the complex legacy of his captivity. "I arrived in Texas hating Americans. I left understanding them, not always agreeing, but understanding. When I returned to Germany, this understanding helped me navigate the American occupation, which many of my countrymen found humiliating, but which I recognized as relatively benevolent." Later, when tensions between America and the Soviet Union threatened a new war, I could explain to my neighbors that Americans were not the monsters Soviet propaganda described. My captivity gave me perspective that proved valuable throughout my life. The educational value of the POW story extends beyond historical interest to offer insights relevant to contemporary international relations and military policy. The American decision to adhere scrupulously to the Geneva Convention, despite knowledge of Axis mistreatment of Allied prisoners, demonstrated both ethical commitment and strategic calculation. This example has informed subsequent debates about treatment of prisoners in later conflicts, from Vietnam to the War on Terror, providing historical perspective on the practical and moral dimensions of these policies. For communities in Texas, the POW story offers a connection to global history that occurred literally in their backyards. Local historical societies have incorporated this chapter into educational programs, helping residents understand how their communities participated in a worldwide conflict. Archaeological investigations at former camp sites have become community projects, engaging citizens in recovering and interpreting this history. Annual events commemorating the camps have developed in several communities, sometimes including visits from former prisoners or their descendants. The most poignant reunions occurred when former prisoners returned to Texas as elderly men to visit the places of their captivity. Gustav Mueller, who had been held at Camp Hearn from 1943 to 1946, returned in 2007 at age 86. Standing on the former campgrounds, now largely reclaimed by nature, he reflected, "Here I was an enemy, yet treated with humanity. Here I learned that Americans were not as our propaganda had portrayed them. Here, strangely, I found a kind of freedom. Freedom from Nazi ideology, freedom to read books that had been banned in Germany, freedom to think for myself." My 3 years as a prisoner in Texas shaped the remaining 60 years of my life. Such visits highlighted the central paradox of the POW experience, that captivity had provided forms of liberation. For men indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, the American camps offered exposure to alternative ideas. For soldiers exhausted by years of combat, they provided safety and recovery. For young men whose development had been interrupted by war and military service, they offered educational opportunities and time for reflection. This is not to romanticize captivity, which remained a profound restriction of freedom, but to recognize its unexpected dimensions. The children and grandchildren of former prisoners have also sought connection with this history. Family pilgrimages to former campsites have become more common, reflecting interest in understanding how the war shaped previous generations. Descendant communities in both Germany and the United States have established networks to share information and preserve family histories. These efforts recognize that the POW experience affected not only the men who lived it directly, but also subsequent generations whose family dynamics, values, and opportunities were influenced by it. Maria Schneider, granddaughter of a former prisoner at Camp Swift, visited the site in 2015. "My grandfather rarely spoke about the war, but he often mentioned Texas," she explained. "He kept a small box of mementos, a camp newspaper, a recreation program, photographs. I never understood why these items from captivity seemed more precious to him than his military decorations. Standing where he once lived as a prisoner, I began to understand. This place represented a turning point, a transition from the world of his youth to the world he would inhabit as an adult." For him, Texas was not just a place of captivity, but a place of transformation. The material culture produced in the camps, artwork, furniture, musical instruments, theatrical props, educational materials constitutes a unique category of wartime artifacts. These items, created under conditions of restriction, yet often displaying remarkable creativity and craftsmanship, have attracted increasing attention from collectors, museums, and scholars. They represent tangible evidence of how prisoners maintained cultural identity, developed skills, and expressed themselves despite captivity. The technical ingenuity displayed in creating these items with limited materials highlights the resilience of the human spirit under adverse conditions. Perhaps the most striking examples are the nativity scenes, elaborate miniature theaters, and ship models constructed by prisoners from materials salvaged from camp supplies. Wooden ration crates became furniture. Tin cans were transformed into intricate lanterns. Toothbrush handles were carved into chess pieces. These objects, many now preserved in museums, demonstrate how creativity flourished even within the constraints of imprisonment. They serve as physical embodiments of the larger story, enemies who became, if not friends, then at least something more complex than the simplified categories of wartime propaganda. The food culture that developed in the camps offers another window into this history. German prisoners, accustomed to different culinary traditions, initially found American food strange and sometimes unappetizing. Over time, camp kitchens evolved to incorporate elements of both cuisines. Prisoners working in mess halls learned American cooking techniques, while introducing German recipes adapted to available ingredients. This culinary exchange, documented in surviving camp menus and recipes, represents one of the most intimate forms of cultural interaction. Carl Schmidt, who worked in the Camp Hearn kitchen, kept a handwritten cookbook of recipes developed during his captivity. After repatriation, he opened a small restaurant near Hamburg that featured what he called Texas German cuisine, traditional German dishes influenced by American ingredients and techniques. His restaurant became popular with American occupation personnel, creating an ironic full circle from prisoner cooking for guards to former prisoner cooking for occupiers. Schmidt's grandson continues to operate the restaurant today, preserving recipes that originated in a POW camp kitchen. The POW camps also left linguistic legacies. German prisoners acquired English through daily interaction, formal classes, and American media. This language acquisition was not merely technical, but cultural, exposing them to American idioms, humor, and thought patterns. Simultaneously, communities near the camps gained exposure to German language and culture. This linguistic exchange created another channel for mutual understanding that transcended the adversarial relationship dictated by the war. Historian Robert Faulkner, who studied language use in Camp Hearn records, notes that a distinct camp dialect emerged, a hybrid of German-English military terminology and camp-specific slang. You can see in the camp newspapers how language evolved, Faulkner explains. Early issues are written in formal Standard German. By 1945, the text includes Americanisms, English words with German grammatical endings, and uniquely camp-created terms. This linguistic hybridization reflected the cultural hybridization occurring within the camps. As the 21st century advances and first-hand witnesses to this history disappear, the responsibility for remembering and interpreting the POW experience passes to subsequent generations. Digital preservation efforts, archaeological research, museum exhibitions, and educational programs all contribute to maintaining this knowledge. The challenge lies in conveying not just facts but understanding, helping contemporary audiences comprehend how enemy soldiers housed in Texas became participants in a complex human drama that transcended the categories of friend and foe. In this effort, the POW story offers valuable perspectives on enduring questions about warfare, captivity, cultural exchange, and reconciliation. It demonstrates how policies rooted in international law and human dignity can achieve both moral and practical objectives. It illustrates how individual relationships can develop across barriers of nationality, language, and conflict. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in the midst of humanity's most destructive conflicts, opportunities for understanding and connection persist. The German prisoners who experienced America through Texas captivity carried that experience back to a shattered homeland, where it influenced their participation in post-war reconstruction. The Americans who interacted with these prisoners, guards, employers, teachers, neighbors, gained perspectives that complicated simplistic wartime narratives. Both groups, through direct contact with supposed enemies, discovered the essential humanity that transcends national divisions and ideological differences. This legacy resonates beyond the specific historical moment of World War II to offer insights relevant to contemporary conflicts and their aftermath. As modern wars produce their own prisoners and displaced populations, the Texas POW story provides historical perspective on how captivity can be conducted humanely, how former enemies can be reintegrated into peaceful society, and how personal connections can develop even across the divisions of warfare. For the men who experienced it directly, captivity in Texas represented a strange interlude, a period outside the normal trajectory of their lives, yet one that profoundly influenced their subsequent paths. For many, it provided unexpected opportunities for education, skill development, and exposure to democratic values. For others, it remained primarily a period of restriction and uncertainty. For nearly all, it complicated their understanding of America, of Germany, and of themselves. Perhaps the final word belongs to Johann Weber, who spent 3 years at Camp Swift before returning to Bavaria, where he became a teacher. In a 1998 interview shortly before his death, he reflected, "In Texas, I learned that the world was both smaller and larger than I had imagined. Smaller because I discovered that Americans and Germans, despite different languages and customs, shared fundamental human experiences. Larger because I glimpsed possibilities beyond the narrow nationalism that had dominated my youth. My time as a prisoner opened my mind in ways that might not have happened otherwise. It was, in the midst of a terrible war, an unexpected gift, As the physical traces of the camps fade and the generation that experienced them passes, their story remains as testament to how humanity can assert itself even in the divisive context of global war. The German prisoners who encountered America through Texas captivity, and the Americans who came to know them not as abstract enemies, but as individuals, jointly created a historical episode that transcended the bitter conflict that brought them together. In ice cream shared on hot Texas afternoons and Coca-Cola drunk under the supervision of guards, they found common ground that would, in time, contribute to the reconciliation of nations that had been locked in existential struggle.